More than 15 million Americans have a hunting or fishing license. It's a long enjoyed pastime that gets people into the outdoors.
Oh, it's so fun, right? Now you got a celebrity chef turning that hobby into a gourmet meal. So delicious. We're joined now by Kevin Gillespie. He's a former Top Chef contestant who now has his own restaurants, of course, here in the metro Atlanta area. And we're joined via Zoom, or kind of just chatting with you over the airwaves here. And Ken, we're so glad. I mean, I'm honored to interview you, and we're just so glad to get this different idea of what we can eat. Because on this show, we talk a lot about, you know, the problems in the cattle industry, and there's the methane and all of that. But let's talk about your interest. Did you start as a chef and then become a hunter, or were you a hunter and were like, I got to figure out how to cook this food?
Well, I grew up in a family of hunters. My dad, uncles, grandparents, everybody was very avid in the outdoors. And so I grew up with it, but I kind of put it on hold, in all honesty, when I started cooking professionally. And only recently did I sort of find my way back to it. And in my mind, it's just a natural evolution of my desire as a chef to always be utilizing the best ingredients possible and the ones that are the most sustainable for our environment.
Nice.
Cool. So you started a project called Sabretooth. What is that, and what can people learn from that project?
Sabretooth was my desire to prove the validity, if you will, culinarily speaking, of wild game. It's interesting that when you look at old menus from the United States from the early 1900s, late 1800s, when you look at menus of the finest restaurants in Europe, wild game factors very heavily in the finest places, but for some reason it doesn't here. And my gut instinct was that a lot of folks nowadays think of it as a throwaway or something that is only usable in times of need and need alone. I would argue against that and say that I think maybe the finest proteins, the finest fish that we can find ourselves using are the ones that we can't buy, that we have to go harvest with our own two hands. And so Sabretooth is meant to bring people into that fold and convert them in the best way I know how, which is to serve them something delicious.
That is
that's
so
great.
cool.
It is so cool. And, you know, just thinking about some of the conversations you've had with people in your world after you feed them maybe something that they've never eaten before, what do you think this is teaching them about conservation and the idea of food in grocery stores in general?
Well, I think it does a couple of things. I think the first is that it does dispel that fear that people have of wild game. You always hear people go like, I just don't know. Like, is it going to taste weird? Is it going to be, quote, gamey? And that, you know, that sort of makes me laugh when I hear that. I'm like, it should taste gamey. It's game. But at the same time, I think what it also does is that for people who have already started this journey of trying to be more accountable with the food that they serve their families, they recognize that there are problems with purchasing meat at this point. And that doesn't mean that it's all wrong, but there is a lot of it that isn't the best for us. And so I think people realize that this is the next step. It's part of the evolution of being a person who's committed to knowing where every ounce of food that's on your table comes from.
Mm-hmm. So talk to us a little bit more about that, because we've touched on it a bit. What is the benefit, the benefits that you know you're getting from eating the food, the meat that you say caught or hunted versus buying it from a store?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of them. First, nutritionally speaking, we're talking about protein that is a lot more densely packed in the sense that there is higher protein per gram than there is in farm-raised product. The second is that it's obviously lower in fat, it's lower in saturated fats, and it has a lot of beneficial minerality that's good for it's good for us. It makes us healthier people. I also think there is just the reality of the fact that when you have to do the work to harvest an animal for yourself, you have a lot greater tendency to not waste things because there's a lot of effort that goes into this. It's a very cathartic process. And so you find that people are utilizing the whole animal as opposed to the grocery store method of let's show up and buy a steak in cellophane and call it a day. This makes people a lot more aware of the reality of what it means for something to give up its life to feed us.
True.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's so true. And, you know, this last question is going to be more specifically geared towards me and anybody else who's interested in hunting and fishing, because I just want to know, you know, what tips you have for some people who are trying to elevate our meals at home, especially when I'm like, man, this is so delicious, and like the kids or the wife is like, it's okay, trying to trick them into making sure they're like, no, this is so good.
Well, I always tell folks, like, you know, with wild game, the generalities are that you either cook it very quickly or you cook it for a very, very long time. What I always try to tell people is that don't try to come up with this off the top of your head. Turn to the resources that already exist. There are loads of great cookbooks, especially ones written by German, French, Austrian, Spanish, Italian chefs that utilize wild game. You're not making a substitution. You'd be cooking a recipe exactly as it's intended. And when you try dishes like that, the first time you braise, feral hog and make homemade pasta and serve it to your family, they're not going to ever want to buy a store-bought pork chop ever again.
Oh, that's a good advice.
Guess you're taking me hunting, Jordan. I've been convinced.
Or just cook something for you to try.
Well,
Either
there you
way.
go. That's true. Kevin Gillespie, celebrity chef and conservationist, thanks so much for joining us today. Yeah, that was
It'd be better? We should just go to one of his restaurants and just eat some of the food.
Now
he's
you're
got
talking
there,
my language.
All right. For more stories like this, make sure you guys check out Pattrn on the Weather Channel app on Roku. You can also find us on the streaming channels listed right there.